Good morning to all of you and also to the people who are listening to us through Zoom.
Okay.
So, a pottery as chronological marker counts among the most reliable categories of material culture in prehistory. It also carries social and functional information and is often a primary research subject in its own right. The study of pottery has the potential of offering relative associations of archaeological material important for the formation of site sequences and chronologies. First-hand study of pottery data is the basis of traditional relative chronologies. The ordering of archaeological material can greatly be assisted by statistical methods like frequency seriation and correspondence analysis. Correspondence analysis, which I will call hereafter CA, in particular, concerns seriation problems by helping us obtaining a relative ordering of archaeological assemblages. It is a popular statistical method, rendering simultaneously an ordering of artifacts and assemblages, providing eventually the relative ordering. CA has been used for pottery assemblages with promising results from sites like the medieval city of Tours in France, Roman Sagalassos in Turkey, and the Chalcolithic necropolis of Varna in Bulgaria, that we listened to name a few cases. For the Aegean, in particular, the first attempt was made by Jack Davis and John Cherry back in 1984. In order to seriate well-stratified Lake Cycladic I deposits from Phyllakopia at Milos, they used the statistical analysis system program. What they did back then was to separate 8 mutually exclusive composite categories of pottery, for example, conical cups, Minoan imports, and other categories, then showed the percentage frequencies of each category, and by using multidimensional scaling, MDS, a multivariate statistical technique close to today's CA, of similarity among their units. This was their attempt to establish more clearly the relative sequence of Late Bronze I levels at the site, and the first attempt to seriate deposits this way in the Aegean. There have been made some attempts to use these methods or variations of this method, like multiple CA or constrained CA, dealing mainly with osteological and zooarchaeological material in the Aegean. The site where this analysis has been applied on a large scale is Troy, of Donald Easton and Bernhard Benninger. Peter Pavuk, in his 2010 article, epitomizes the pitfalls and recommendations concerning the use of the method, offering to us useful insights. In our paper, we'll attempt to use this analysis as a methodological tool to tackle questions of relative chronologies concerning Neopalatial Crete. At Sissi, there are many Neopalatial deposits of different character that we would like to seriate with the use of this formal method, this exploratory technique, which eventually provides visual images rather than a series of numerical values. That's the importance of the CA. That is its importance, actually. Where do our data come from? And are they well defined to ensure a proper use of the method of a CA-based pottery seriation? So, the material presented here is already studied, qualitatively and quantitatively analyzed, and preliminarily published in the last volume of the Sissi excavations. It comprises primary material from a recently excavated Minoan site on Crete, characterized by a long and continuous history between 2600 and 1200 BC, a site excavated since 2007 by the Belgian School at Athens under the direction of Professor Jan Driessen, with the most updated methods, ensuring proper documentation of data on each step. This is one of the cases where a vast amount of Neopalatial ceramic material has been quantitatively analyzed. The analysis is the product of data processing by one and the same person, ensuring a level of standardization of data recording. This is very important for the use of this method because it secures a homogeneous treatment of the assemblages as far as intrasite depositional characterization and hypostylistic analysis are concerned. The data derived from the analysis of 36,824 pots and pottery fragments that are diagnostic. The analysis only takes into consideration material that can be typologically identified. Types are seriated in conjunction with stratigraphy. This is why in two cases, in two deposits, we have two periods represented. This is shown on the next slide. The character of the deposits varies. We have first, a primary floor deposit. Second, a large field successive primary depositions, in fact, related to commensal activities. Third, a field again related to commensal activities. 4, a large secondary deposit in the domestic quarter. And 5, a primary fire destruction deposit. These deposits cover the Neopalatial period. The date and the stratigraphy are secured. In more detail, the primary floor deposit, the first one, is securely dated in the MM3A period and has no residual material. This is a deposit with a small amount of material, circa 1,300 diagnostic sherds. Second, the large field successive primary depositions that relate to commensal activities taking place in the Kurzerder building, which is a monumental building with architectural characteristics commonly found in Minoan palaces. This deposit preserves stratified layers of MM3A and MM3B pottery with no residual material. This deposit includes a large part of the Neopalatial material presented in the CA graphs, circa 14,200 sherds. This is a deposit with a less residual material. Third, the smaller field of MM3B pottery related to commensal activities found in an open area with no associated architecture contained some residual material which we were able to remove from the analysis, making up to circa 1,200 sherds. This is a deposit with the most residual material. 4. The large secondary field of LL1A pottery from the two spaces of the domestic quarter, with related stratigraphy covered by this large field when out of use, is clearly LM1A with some residual material. This includes a large part of the Neopalatial material presented in the CA graphs, circa 12,700 sherds. The two spaces are treated separately in the analysis. And 5, the primary fire destruction deposit of LM1B period, comprising also a smaller LM1A deposit in the area of the staircase, well defined, again, with some residual material that we excluded from our analysis. It contains circa 7,200 pottery fragments. And here, in the bar chart plot, we see the quantities of the pottery, which we can visually compare to each other. These are our main 8 taxonomic categories that we will see in the CA graphs. 1 and 3 are our MM3A deposits together. 4 is the large Kurzerder building deposit of commensal practices. The MM3B part, which forms our MM3B bulk of data together with deposit number 2. Then we have the LM1A material, 5, 6, 7, and the LM1B, 8. The CA graphs are mainly relied to first, the quantification of context-based pottery typologies, and second, a context-based typostylistic approach with presence-absence data. The first one presented taxa and countings on a total of 36,824 pottery fragments, while the second one, presenting taxa and presence-absence associations, relies on a database of 1,480 catalogued vessels. What follows is a preliminary pilot study to verify if this method is applicable for chronological seriation in the case of Neopalatial Crete on a well-stratified site, Sissi. The contingency table used for data aggregation is this. The context-based pottery typology, 28 types with quantified information frequency data, where I have counted different shape categories types at the columns according to deposits at the rows. You can see here, it's coded information, okay? It's the conical cap, the broad conical cap, the convex cap as it goes, the straight-sided cap, the S-profile cap, the bowl here, the flaring bowl. It's all coded. The table is based on the 36,824 pottery fragments. I'm telling this all the time because it is important to understand the quantities. What the CA does is to compare counted taxa across associations. The view scatter option here allows us to see all the data points plotted in the coordinate system given by the correspondence analysis. Here we see the types together with the context. Just a note for those who are not acquainted with CA. Physical proximity of points on the CA graph is a reflection of close association of the respective artifact assemblage patterning. The plot shows a much wider distribution of types, which is the light blue circle, with respect to context distribution, which is the smaller blue circle in the middle. The types spread further, indicating that many of them went in use earlier, went out of use at later points, or lasted through all the periods considered. Dr. Wenninger, whom we consulted concerning the shape of the CA, explains this through the presence of Durchläufer, shapes found in all excavation units, which pull the outer limbs of the CA together. The distribution doesn't seem to reproduce a proper parabola, which is a horseshoe-shaped curve that represents a chronological sequence, but rather a cloud of points with the principal component diagonally crossing the centroid area and spreading from the lower right to the upper left quadrants. Moving to the CA plot of context only, again based on the previous table, basically two clusters are formed in separate quadrants of the graph, the red with the earlier deposits and the blue with the later ones. The younger end for us is the left, the older is the right. This is not always clear, and one has to demonstrate it usually. But here we demonstrate it according to typological parameters corresponding with the stratigraphic sequences of northeastern Crete. We can observe that the later, the LM1A and LM1B contexts are positively associated and clustered as a group in the right part. Oh, sorry. Here. The preceding MM3A and MM3B contexts are distributed in the left parts of the graph, with the two MM3B contexts, space 5.16 and 10.6, closely connected and clustered together. Space 10.6, MM3A in turn, seems to have a good association with both the MM3B contexts. And finally, space 4.4 MM3A, the green circle is very much shifted vertically along the positive part of axis 2, showing its profile is quite different from both the later LM1A and B context and the other MM3A and 3B context. Stands on its own. And here we have the data in CalPAL, which is a radiocarbon calibration program, which allows us to perform different kinds of analysis, also CA. So we have the 3 barcode plots. It's a very important program. So we have the 3 barcode plots. The red is the context, the blue are the types, and the black barcodes are the positions on axis 1 after the polynomial fitting. The polynomial doesn't retain a very nice parabola. It is very flattened, and there are inversions in the model. It is interesting to note that the 2 assemblages of space 10.6 are very, very close together, and the 2 LM1A context 2.8 and especially 2.6 look way too distanced with respect to the LM1B one. Note here that it is not certain that the factorial distances reflect time scale. This is important. And thus we cannot explain the lengths of the gaps in terms of time. This needs external confirmation. And here we have the table with negative and positive associations of context based on the CA, which provides additional useful detail in evaluating the relationships. The columns and rows include the context, and the table shows whether one context is positively or negatively related to the other. We can see that, in fact, 2 clusters of data are formed, one representing the early and one the late Neopalatial period. For example, the 2 MM3A contexts are positively associated with each other. The MM3A part of context 10.6, which is the large deposit connected with commensal activities, is positively associated with the MM3B part of the same deposit, a fact obviously related to functional parameters. But the MM3A deposit, the 4.4, doesn't do the same. Both MM3B contexts, 10.6 and 5.16, are highly positively associated with each other, which is important for the integrity of the period as far as Sissi is concerned. On the other hand, the late Neopalatial deposits are negatively associated with the early Neopalatial deposits, but positively associated with each other. In general, the 2 clusters formed by the early and late Neopalatial material are present and visible on the table. Moving on with our second contingency table for analysis based on presence-absence data. Here we have the rows with the context and the columns at the top with specific types or combinations of types and styles. There is a total of 136 entries of coded taxa. It is impossible to see them all here, they don't fit. I have some of the categories here to show you as an example. They are also presented according to wares. So we have the monochrome convex cap and the convex cap with dark on light decoration, for example. Both are taken into consideration in the analysis as separate entries. So apart from the shapes, specific combinations of shapes and decoration forms here in this table the coded taxa. The table is based on a total of 1,480 catalogued vessels. The CA in this case compares presence-absence data aggregation. Here, the CA plot with types, typostylistic categories and contexts. The CA point cloud is approximated by a parabolic regression curve, meaning that the distribution of the pottery seems to form a sort of parabola, with a big cluster around the centroid and a later tail, which is close to the LM1A context to the right, that is somewhat, this tail is pulled towards type M34 that you see here and DL28. This is the cap Rhyton and the S-profile cap with the floral pattern, which are later types. So you see, it is in the tail at the end. Clusters of interest are formed by types M10, P2, and P4 here, pulled by the earliest context. If you see, it's very close to our earlier context. These are the broad conical cup, the plain straight-sided cup, and the ridge-necked jug, which are all considered early Neopalatial types. Then we have types that cluster at a lower level on the negative axis, LD1, DL2, DL3, and M4, drawn by both the MM3A 4.4 and the MM3B 516 contexts. And these are the straight-sided cup. If you see the distance, they are here, they are drawn by that, they are drawn by that. So their value is in the middle. And these are the straight-sided cups, the monochrome, and the decorated versions, as well as the in and out bowl, which interestingly, these are types very characteristic of the early Neopalatial period, especially the dawn of the MM3B. The clustering of the straight-sided cups in particular is indicative of the very distinctive imprint this shape makes in the analysis. Of interest is also type M1 here. The carinated cup, specially distinct from the others, excluded, a type that indeed belongs to an earlier period, but still appears rarely as a remnant in MM3A contexts. Type DL17, here, another example, I use them all as examples, okay? Another example here is the S-profile cup with ripple pattern, a cup again characteristic of the MM3B. It stands very close to the most representative deposit of the period, which is that, 10.6 MM3B. Another clustering, and I will finish with this graph, is formed by DL30, 31, and 32, this. Jugs, jars, and bell-shaped cups decorated with floral patterns indicative of a date in the later Neopalatial period. So you see the floral patterns clustered together. So what is evident here is that we can make meaningful associations of the data shown on the graph. These associations do not necessarily show time, but interesting observations of probable chronological value can be made. Now moving to the CA plot of context only, again based on the catalog material, we clearly have two contexts that stand out, the 4.4 MM3A and the 516 MM3B1. The graph displays distortions and inversions along axis 1. The other contexts seem to cluster from the area around the centroid to the positive part of axis 1 in an elongated cloud shape with inversions, especially 4.19 LM1B, which should have been the last in the distribution. This inversion of 4.19 LM1B with 2.6 LM1A is something that we came upon several times in our tests and its further investigation. This could be indicative of a very early date of this specific LM1B context, or of a very late date of the LM1A1, in terms of the positional seriation always. The point is that these two contexts stand very close to each other, and the pottery is not very helpful, including many plain pottery and not characteristic styles of the relevant periods. Again, the position of the context on the graph is something, that is the important thing, is something that can be archaeologically explained. Now we continue with a graph based on the previous table, but in this case, the graph presents only cups and bowls, the type showed on the slide, and is generally based on typostylistic parameters that have been proven to be time sensitive, even among different Neopalatial phases for Sissi. Now the parameters for the graph are changed because the pottery where it is based on is 1,100 vessels. So this plays a role always. We look at the pottery and context graph first, the data seem to form a structure comparable to a parabola from an earlier cluster around types LD12 and DL5 that you see at the left top, which is the lettering bowl with ripple pattern and the bell-shaped cup, to a later cluster around M13 and DL28 on the right, which is the cup right on, and the S-profile cup with floral pattern that we saw before. The period context detail shows once again a structure which is interpretable as a parabola, although with a few inversions. Again, we observe the inversion of 4.19, the LM1B context. To see it here. On the left context, 516 MM3B stands out. This context is functionally specific, containing many colors, but it is also the deposit with the most residual material. Again, the two records from space 10.6, its MM3A part and its MM3B are clustered closely together. Context 4.4 MM3A is located in a highly negative part of axis 1, here. We could say that the CA plot with cup and bowl types only, dating sensitive typostylistic categories, confirms our previous observations. Now we come to the conclusions. Here we focus on the results of CA and their implications for the relative chronology of the site, Sissi. Now, briefly, one could say that this method can confirm the pre-existing seriation based on stratigraphy and pottery dating, and that it allows close comparison between different deposits on the same site. It can generate sequences, that is the main thing. But in order to be more precise with dating, one needs external input. One needs the radiocarbon samples from the site that have well CA positions. And at this point, the method acts complementary to the sampling strategy. Returning to our most important graph based on the quantification of context-based typologies of 36,000 pottery fragments, we will just make some observations. First, the 4.4 MM3A seems to form an outlier in all our testings. Why is that so? If we take into consideration what CA does with the provided data, it finds associations. Then, indeed, this context is not associated to the others. It only shares some types with the other MM3A context. This deposit speaks for a formative stage of the period, where you have some earlier types, like those you see on the picture, cups with flaring walls, large cups, together with new types. This deposit also contains a small amount of pottery. Everything plays a role. The situation shows that more deposits of this phase need to be studied in order to get a more comprehensive picture. Second, the 10.6 MM3A part clusters well with the MM3B part, revealing a very smooth transition from the MM3A to the MM3B as far as type evolution and sequences is concerned for Sissi. Third, the MM3B deposits are closely related to each other, as mentioned before, which is important for the integrity of the period, as we mentioned. And four, there is always an inversion of one or two LM1A contexts with the LM1B1, a point that we referred to before and still trying to understand. Now, some points for the future. First, the seriation obtained by the CA requires further decoding based on thorough knowledge of the pottery and the stratigraphy. Second, we need to understand the outliers pinpointed by the method. The CA results might be improved by applying outlier analysis, which is machine learning. Third, it is necessary to add more context in the analysis to reduce the spreading of types on the graphs and form better clustered, better defined clusters. 4. A systematic data reduction, mainly typology, will allow us to comprehend the seriation and achieve temporal resolution. Now, we avoided to manually optimize data input due to the large number of potential permutation. Again, outlier analysis might help with this. 5. We also need to further work with the analysis under statistical conditions. This is very important, in order to evaluate it as a chronological sequence. By this, we mean analyze them in barcode plots, By this, we mean analyze the context sequence according to their positions on CA factors and visualize them in barcode plots in CalPAL, like the thing that Bernie showed us yesterday. This would allow us to correlate floating sequences under the notion of floating chronologies, like they do in dendrochronology. And 6, the temporal direction of the established sequence needs to be determined on radiocarbon data alongside with references to the original stratigraphy. This is the methodology that will be followed in order to achieve the main goal, to be able to use the knowledge obtained from the correspondence analysis for a better radiocarbon sampling strategy at the site of Sissi in particular, and be able to slowly form a relative sequence scale that fits the calibration curve together with external information providing by radiocarbon samples analysis. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Iro. You seem to have a very large database, but with various aspects of the CA, you obviously had problems because you think the data is not large enough, particularly for the outlying MM3A. You obviously, that's dated by traditional means, but then with the other MM3A group, which is linked with the MM3B group, you said that implies a smooth transition from MM3A into MM3B at that point. Can you give your own traditional assessment of the early MM3A and its lack of smooth transition or smooth transition from that into later MM3A? Or are you just saying that the CA is actually deficient at this point? The same would be said of the inversion of 4.19 and 2.6, the LM1B and LM1A groups. You can look at the material and say, no, this LM1B group should not be here, it should be up there.
So you are asking me to be biased?
Yes. Well,
I'm trying to avoid it. I'm trying to avoid being biased.
Just for the sake of yes, I'm asking you to use your intellect and have an opinion. If you call that bias, that's all right.
Okay. Yes, I'm based on the data, on what I see. Of course, it needs more context to be able to talk about the MM3A. We don't have enough context for Sissi, and there are contexts, there are a lot of contexts, but need to be studied. So the picture will be improved. It is work in progress.
Yeah, I can see that it will be improved. Okay, thanks a lot. Start here, and then Charlotte.
Very good. First of all, I know how this research started and how far it, but I would really like to congratulate you. It's really wonderful to see this, because these things are really difficult. A general comment I would have, if it might interest you, is that you saw yesterday of the resolution that I'm expecting we have for Markov amount joy. No? And I can see, my guess is that your resolution is already now better than they have. It's better. And of course, you have these discrepancies here and there. And whenever I see this sort of stuff, for me, it's unproblematic because we're not talking about LM1A or LM1B. These are names. And we are talking about very specific ceramics from a very specific hole in a very specific site, which has been given names. So we are looking at the properties of the material. These words of looking for is it earlier, younger, is a bit misleading, actually, sort of thing. And in general terms, what I thought was really fascinating was that we can see in many of your CA diagrams that the architectural units, the find units where you get the material out of, are more central, and the scores, the values of the pottery is further to the left and further to the right. And this is a very wonderful property of the CA in general that we can see.
Yes. It's very rare to have it actually.
Excavation units with the pottery, we can see what the properties of the ceramics look like from earlier finds, earlier context and younger context, which you haven't even excavated yet. We can see where the pottery is coming from and where it's going. And you mentioned this already, and thanks very much, but I would like to emphasize that you have already seen this. It's really good.
Thanks. Charlotte Manuel.
Thank you, Hero. That was fantastic presentation. Very clear also, which is really good to be able to understand this CA analysis. And I was very interested by the way, your hypothesis to explain the position of the most recent context, 4.19, so late Minoan 1B context, to explain the position in the graph, like close to the LM1A. So your hypothesis would be that maybe it's close in time. So it would be a very good working hypothesis to test, because in the history of the site, that would be very interesting to analyze. My question is more about how would you explain the position of the late Minoan 1A context? Because from what I've seen, these contexts are very homogeneous LM1A nature. And they seem to be very distant from each other. So is it your hypothesis more about function or anything else that you
It is about the types. The types, they form that by themselves. It's what the types say and how they correlate to each other. It depends. We need to see the shapes, its particular shapes. That's what I said. We need to do further decoding of what it says. It's interesting. Of course, it's something that we need to do, to compare this LM1A and see why they are distant. And again, it might be because of the functional parameters. This we need to see. That's why we need to do the outliers analysis.
Badly yesterday.
Badly?
Make sure.
That shouldn't be okay. Okay.
Yes, but
Thank you, Jerome, also from my side. I like the result as well. The only thing is that the graph is a bit blurred still. So you mentioned by yourself the low number, and there's also another aspect. So if you talk about these peripheral contexts or shapes or types which you defined, I learned two things from the specialists. The one is high number, and there it's if you deal only with 8 contexts, that's too low. So you have to reach a number approximately 200 or something. Then it comes to results, because you have to filter them. That's the point. And I help myself. For instance, I have LPK sites in Central Europe where I have the same problem. On one side, I have only, let's say, 20 contexts, which I can introduce into the database. And I help myself including other sites where I have similar shapes, because the extract from this is limited, And the second thing is, and it's even more important,
excuse me.
One has to make the correspondence analysis always together with the seriation. So the seriation is important because you can see the true runners and the single representations. And maybe that's the very reason one of your contexts drops so out. So if you make a seriation, you can see and understand better
a frequency
what is
seriation.
behind your data.
You mean a frequency seriation?
Yes, just a presence absence table where you achieve this linear ordering. It's one click in the.
Okay,
the path.
okay, yeah, I see. Did you mention before that you added also other contexts from other sites?
Yes,
That's interesting.
if they're comparable, so it's
Yes.
a solution for the beginning. If you have enough context from one side, then it's much better, of course, but if not, so
It will take some time.
yeah.
We will eventually, but it will take some time.
Yeah, sorry.
So real like everyone else, I thought you really explained the process beautifully. I mean, that just kudos to you for that. Lovely. I wonder if I understand correctly, you're looking for differences. The differences help create the pattern, the parabola. You were looking for differences. So I wouldn't quite agree with Bernie's recent comment there that MM3, L1A are just labels, because certain shapes are different. Even like a cook, I was thinking, for instance, a cook pot. So an MM3A cook pot leg or rim will be different from a cook pot rim or leg in L1B. And it wasn't easy to grasp the 130 categories you have. So do you use that distinction? I mean, a round leg versus an oval leg, a flat leg?
This is in the methodological part.
Yeah, well, for instance, cups. So when I see straight-sided cups from M3B versus L1A.
Of course, I had to make some selections, and this is where the subjectivity enters. I have to select the types.
Yeah.
I had to select them.
But they can be meaningful, and they can be observed. They're not completely subjective. So I guess that was, I'm looking for.
They are
more
meaningful in the
sensitivity
sense
to
of dating.
decoration, shape that might tease out difference, I guess would be.
And the point is that with this analysis, this is the interesting thing. You can add things up. You can add categories. You can add types. Whatever you see as sensitive, you can eventually add it, or potentially of chronological value. You can add it and see how it goes, how it is, how the percentages are formed and the numbers. But it's interesting to have the quantification data to quantify. With present substance, some other things might come up.
Well, if there aren't any more questions and no questions online, we'll move on to the next paper. Thank you very much, Eruption.
Thank you.